Hello and welcome to my second video on examining the attendance tool, the basic sample code that's the attendance tool. Eventually I will be looking at all the branches, but right now I'm going to go through master and I will go through the handlebars and Silex and Temple.js branches in separate videos. Okay, so the first thing to take a look at, let me go ahead and bring this up in Atom. So one of the interesting things is that you switch between these by doing git checkout. So you check out whichever one you want, and it's kind of interesting. So I'm sitting here in the master branch. You see it says master down here, and you can watch as I say git checkout Silex. Say give me the Silex version, and then poof, it just changes, or I can say I'll go back to master, and so master is what I want to talk to. But these are permanent branches of sort of like, there's some things that they share, like some of the internationalization, database.php and register.php, which I talked about in a previous video. Okay, so there is API documentation for these various APIs, like the core stuff. The core stuff is where a lot of the meat of the work happens. This is really the high-level stuff. There's util stuff, which is the lower-level stuff. That these classes, the Tsugi util classes, are unopinionated classes, and the Tsugi core are the opinionated classes. And different ones of these things are usable kind of outside. And there's like Silex, which is the support for Silex. There's support for Laravel, and just some of these things are utility code. And so let's take a look. Let's see which one we're going to take a look at first. So we're going to look at the settings, core LTIX, and utilnet. So utilnet is a series of network things that send and receive things like sending data, getting data, wrappers for curl, etc., etc. And we're going to use core LTIX. That's actually the Tsugi core LTIX is where a lot of important stuff happens. This is the opinionated class that creates the context and all of these things and all kinds of stuff. So that's core LTIX. Oops. And then core settings. I probably should have this. It would make more sense if I said this, because core LTIX is kind of more important. That's okay. So now we make a tiny change. I'll check that in a moment. Okay. So let me first give you an outline, right? So these things all require a config.php, and if we look up, that just is requiring where we're at here in a folder hierarchy is we are in Tsugi, a Tsugi install mod /attend. Now the way Tsugi works, if you look at the config.php, vi.config.php, actually let's do this, vi.config.php, all that says is let's require go up one more directory. So the real config.php is really in /config.php. Part of this is so that you can sort of put these mods all over the place, and in this config.php, which you probably set up when you were setting your Tsugi up, you have got tool folders. And so these tool folders, there can be many of these. And for now, we're just running a purely Tsugi. You'll see my URL is Tsugi. It's not a Koseu website that includes a Tsugi. It's just Tsugi. And so I'm in the, it says please scan tool folders that are the subfolders within admin and the subfolders within mod. And this is where, if I'm using the installation, which is this manage installed tools, that's where to put those. And so I'm in this mod folder. If I cd ... ls-l, in the mod folder, I've got all these different things installed, and attend is the one that I'm working on right now. Okay, so there we go. And those are all my files, and index.php is the code. So that just gives you a sense of where we're at. Let's go back to the code. Config.php, so if you're in a mod folder, wherever you're going to be installed, and it doesn't have to be named mod, and you can't know that you're 2 folders down, you just require one folder above you, config.php, and it's that folder's responsibility to go get the configuration. This does a lot of stuff. It sets up the autoloader. It creates a database connection. It just does tons and tons and tons of stuff for you. There's a way, the one thing you'll sometimes see in code is I ask for cookie sessions, but Tsugi tools really don't want to use cookie sessions unless they absolutely have to. Otherwise, if you use cookie sessions, you can't open multiple tabs and have logged in as different people. And that is super valuable as an LTI tool because each tool has a different context, a different course, a different link, and so you just don't want to have one global session that you're overriding. That's a really, to me, horribly bad practice that 98% of the crappy LTI tools in the world do. So don't do that. Don't use cookies unless you have to. This is one of the reasons I like PHP. Okay, so that sets up a lot of stuff, and this also handles a lot of things. This basically is like a super duper session start from a PHP perspective. It basically says, I need this to be a valid LTI launch. I want it to have a course, a user, and a link. That's the things I require. And blow up. Now this handles launches. This handles coming back once the session's been established and reloading all the launch data from the session, etc., etc. This updates all the core database tables. And there is just a ton of stuff that happens here. When you're done, you have all these global variables like, well, CFG actually comes from config.php, but the user instructor, I borrowed most of these from Moodle, don't tell them that. Okay, and so this is sort of your single sign-on. Then the launch is actually an object that does include things like the user and the result and all those other things, but then we also set some global variables sort of for convenience. Okay, so the settings service. So it turns out that there are settings in IMS LTI 2.0 that are on the course and on the link. And sometimes LTI, the LMS that's launched us does not know anything about settings. It's not an LTI capable. And so what we do is we actually store these locally regardless. And in this case, this is the resource link ID. So you can always store settings on the resource link ID. And this is just some JSON. And this is one of the cool things is there's always these little JSON fields. So if you really just need a resource link ID, a little bit of data that you're going to put in. But if you're just doing settings, you might as well do in the settings because we got some really nice convenience methods that that set this. I don't think we have any data in here. I don't know which activity this is. Link key. We'll see. Whoops. I don't want that. So I don't know which ones these are. Let's just, well, these are the links. We'll see in a sec. Where's the settings? Yeah, okay. So we'll find out. The point is that this settings data in the link table can be accessed on a key by key basis by calling this settings service. Settings service. So this basically says go read from the settings. And it turns out that the way this works is really efficient. It actually doesn't require a separate database call to do this, to pull this stuff in. It's got that all figured out. It does it in advance. And this is a key. This is a default value. In the settings, what we're doing is we are storing this number. 1, 2, 3, let's just put this as 9999. So the teacher sees this thing where they can update the code. So let's go find where that's at. Let's see if it's this one. Nope, it's not that one. Let's take a look at this one. It's this one, see? And there's some other things that it's put in there kind of automatically, like due dates and other things that there's a whole settings dialog that makes that easy. And it's sort of presetting some of these things. But this code, because we're just pulling it out by key value pair, we put that in. And so if I do this and I update that to 1000 and I update the code, we should see, if I can retrieve it, yeah, so that's where that gets stored. And so that's kind of cool in that you don't have to create a table for that because you can kind of drop these things into the core tables because the core tables have both settings and this JSON, which you can actually put anything you want in. I literally could have done this in a second with in the request, in the result, but hang on, we'll get to that. Okay, so this is just loading the old code. That's all that is. So if we look at this, if we look at this, basically, we see that this is sort of a model view controller that I teach in my Web Applications for Everybody course. You can argue about what the most elegant way to do PHP is. You can argue whether PHP is a good idea. I teach this whole course using this very simple single file, and I use PHP as the templating engine. And I have the post handling code, and then I have the preparing for the view. So this is kind of updating the model. This is reading the model as necessary. And then I fall through and I have a simple render. And you can argue whether you like this or not. I don't care. Feel free. But this is my simple one. If you like the other ones, we'll switch in a later one. We'll show you how to do with Silex and routes and all kinds of fancy stuff. Don't worry about that. But this is kind of the basics. So it's really kind of easy to see everything. So this is what happens when we're sending the post code in, right? When I hit this button, it runs that. In the case where it's the instructor, we see that they're instructor. That's true if it's instructor. It's all been taken care of for you. We're just going to take the post code and stick it into the link set. That will update the database and put out a flash message and then redirect. Now, add session is important because this is how we make sure that we keep our a session ID in cookieless sessions. Now, if you're using a cookie session, add session knows that and doesn't put it on. So if I do like a view developer console and I click on the network tab and I clear everything and I do update code of 1, 2, 3, 4, you will see the redirect has the session ID on it. So we did the post to the session ID and then we did a redirect to the session ID, which turned into a get. But we had to put that in, otherwise it wouldn't be automatic. Now what's cool about PHP is some of the links have that stuff in there already, okay? And then of course we return. The clear button, we are going to do a, actually I don't need the return value here, so I can get rid of that. See, I'm finding all the things I don't like in this code. So if so I have a helper variable, which is what I call PDOX, which is kind of like a convenience layer on top of PDO. This has nothing in particular to do with Tsugi. It's a util, which is, it's util. I didn't include it, but it's, if you look at the documentation, it's Tsugi util PDOX. And what I'm saying with this is, if it's a util class, you can easily use this outside Tsugi. And it just turns out, I don't know how much you've used PDO. I love PDO, except to properly do PDO error checking is kind of like 12 lines of code sometimes. And it turns out that what you really want to do is do the query and die if anything goes wrong. Because the only thing that can tend to go wrong is you got a syntax error. If this link doesn't exist, that's not really a syntax error, right? That's a different kind of a problem. So you really need to check all the possible errors and recover from them and log them and all those things, which are about 12, 14 lines of code. And so you can collapse this into one line of code and pretty much just issue your queries. But other than that, it's just PDO with prepared statements and all those things. Now, link ID is the primary key in the link table of what we're doing. So the link ID in this one is 2. Now the key interesting thing about this is this link ID, the link ID has a context ID which is a foreign key. And the context ID, if you were to look at the context ID, you would see that the context ID has a foreign key to the key. So this link is scoped within tenant, within course, and within resource link. And so what happens is you don't have to in our table do anything but the link ID, because that is totally captures tenant, course, and everything, because those are foreign keys to that thing. So link ID is not, it's in a sense truly global, and it captures course and tenant ID. So when you're making a data model, like here in database.php, you're going to want at least one foreign key. Now this one has a dual foreign key because it's also pointing to user, but this foreign key would be enough. So you got to have at least one foreign key with onDelete back into the core database, so that you're, in this case, and especially this case, the link one is the one that sort of properly scopes it from a security perspective. So if you didn't do that, if you didn't have that, you might be crossing tenants, but by putting it to the link ID, you don't cross tenants. User ID, link ID, context ID, these are sort of ways to not cross tenants. And you got to write code that doesn't cross tenants. And then of course we send a post, a flash message, and we send ourselves back to index. If the student types in the code, and so that's over here, when we are a student, so student 1, 2, 3, 4, it's going to post, and then it's going to run, and so it's going to come here. It's going to check to see if the code is right, so we retrieve that old code from settings. If it's the same, and we're going to do an insert statement, and again we're using the link ID, but this we're using user ID because it's user link. Now this bit of code, if I really was tricky, I could have stored it instead of in my own attendance table. I wanted to show how to make my own table. I actually could have stored it right here in the result table, because every launch gets a link, a result. And the result has both the link ID and the user ID, and it's really set up for the grade, but I just have a little JSON there that's mostly null, but you can know that this is per user per link, and you can store stuff in it. And so it's actually, I could have used the result object, and I could have set the JSON. Let's see if I can find that. Tsugi core, see if I got this right. Find the result. So I had to use the result, and then I would have set the JSON or get the JSON, or I could have just set up a single key within that JSON if I really wanted to. So, so the point is there as a convenience variable to get to this result, and that's already link user. So I kind of am, and I could have put the date that they attended, their IP address, I could have put that in that JSON, right? And so, but that's okay. I wanted to show you how to do this. And so I wanted to make a database because I wanted to show you how to make a database. So here's just an insert. This little prefix here, this is a configured variable, and that's because we want to make it so that we can cause Tsugi to put prefixes on every one of these tables. This is again an idea from Moodle in case you want to put sort of multiple database sets, but you've only got one database. That's rare, but you might have some weird hosting situation, and I've had those where you only get one database, and that way you can have kind of like a different prefix for different databases. 98% of the time this is going to be empty, but away we go. And so we're just putting some data in, and then we translate attendance recorded into Spanish, and otherwise we're say the code's incorrect, and then we redirect. And so that is the entire post code. So the next thing we do, and if it's a post, it never exits down to here. So this assumes down in here 49, and later we're in a get. And so if we're the user instructor, we're going to read all the data, do a select, order by. Again, link ID here helps make sure that we're not crossing tenants or looking at data from the wrong link, that we're looking at the data for the relevant link. If it's the student, I just set rows to false, and now I fall down into the view. And these are a whole set of methods for the output. Actually, no, that's in UI for output. Yeah, there is a ton of stuff here. And flash messages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, so what we do is we start the header. This you can put your own code in here if you want to put your own CSS or include your own JavaScript in between here. We start the body. We issue the top nav. Now, interestingly, the top nav depends on whether or not, and that top nav is actually very, very smart. It depends on, there's ways for it to be a full set of menus. You can set it remotely. It can be set via the LTI launch. It also is smart enough, if you take a look at this, it's also smart enough to know that in this case I'm in a frame. And so if I take a look at the frame source here, you will see that there is actually a nav bar here. Okay? But it's set to display none, and then there's a little tiny JavaScript that runs right after that that turns the nav bar on if we're not in an iframe, right? So this way, if somehow this thing, maybe someone, you can't do it in this one, if you could open in a new page, right? There was some href that opened in a new page, and it's got up here, a nav bar would show up. And in this case, the only thing the nav bar would show have to show it to you in view source, is a close button. Yeah, that closes. If it was opened in a new window, it would just do a close. But sometimes it's a more complex thing, and if it actually got launched from an LMS, it would actually be a link back to that learning management system, etc., etc., etc. So the nav is actually pretty smart. The fact that we don't want to see a nav in an iframe doesn't matter, because nav is smart enough to say, oh, I'm an iframe, hide myself. Welcome user course. Well, it just, hello, welcome from Intro to Programming, and away you go. Flash messages puts these little guys out, and then now we're just into the body of the stuff, right? And it's a form. We are putting out internationalized messages with a double underscore, HTML5, UTF-8. I did this because older version of PHP didn't do this automatically, but now I think I could replace all these with HTML entities because later versions of PHP make that the default. Have the form, all this stuff with just the form, whether I'm the teacher or the student. And if I have some rows that I got from that model code above, then I do some looping and print out with HTML UTF-8, and I internationalize all these little strings so that these headings are internationalized automatically. And so that basically is the single index file of this attendance tool. So up next, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the other, well, I got to check this in. So we'll talk about the other branches, the handlebars branch, the Silex branch, and the Temple.js, which take very different approaches from the model view controller. So I hope you found this useful.